Well, welcome as we continue this series of revisiting Whitley Lectures. We've made it all the way to 2009 this time, and we're revisiting or visiting for the first time Sally Nelson's Thousand Crucifixions, the Materialist Subversion of the Church. Just making sure I got the subtitle right. It's fantastic that Sally's with us. There's a few of us on the call. There might be some others joining as the evening goes on, but we're looking forward to engaging Sally with your Whitley lecture. So let me what was the context of writing it? What's it been like perhaps rereading it? Yes, kick us off.
Okay, well, I wrote it as a bit of diversion partway through my PhD research. So I was at that point where you get a little bit stuck, sort of in year two. And I'd been invited to do the Whitley lecture. And so I decided to take some elements of my PhD, but go in a different direction and apply it to disability theology, which it was really my first excursion into reading some disability theology. And there was a lot less available then. It's really boomed as an area since. So it's kind of, it's not solidly in the centre of disability theology, this lecture. I think it's really more about suffering, but there are some elements of disability theology that have crept into it. And since then, I've written more things on disability theology. So it was a good entree for me to do this piece of work and get into reading that new area. Rereading it, yes, I hadn't actually read it again for a long time. So it was fun to go back and read it again. And I thought, when I kind of thought about it in my mind, I thought that I'd actually moved in a very different direction, but I haven't actually. I still think I'd stand by the lecture pretty much as it stands. The only thing that I have done is that I've done a lot more work in exploring McFadden's dialogical personhood since then, but it's not, I don't think it actually alters a great deal of what the lecture is saying to go into that, so that's the main difference. So I think that's probably what I'd like to say. I can do a little summary of some of the key points if you'd like me to.
We'll do that in a second. So let me just ask a bigger question. So your PhD also looked at this question of suffering.
Yes.
As you do in your Whitley. What prompted you to give, I'm guessing, 3 years, maybe more years of your life to exploring the theology of suffering? And that was it experience? Was it questions you had? Was it someone said, "Here's a topic, do that"?
Well, I think I'd been interested in it for quite a long time. I'd had a friend at university whose mother had committed suicide, and he was an atheist. And I was exploring faith at that time, and we used to have a lot of discussions about this. And it seemed to me that whatever else his atheism did, it didn't give him any answers for the experience that he was going through. And so it kind of sparked an interest in my mind at that early stage, which, I mean, I didn't really do anything with it for a long time. But then I had my daughter, and when she was about 4, I returned to work as a hospice chaplain. Now she's quite badly disabled. She's got severe and complex disabilities sort of across the board. So we had a process of coming to terms with that as a family, which took quite a long time. But what I would say is that I don't think I would have gone to work in a hospice if I hadn't had my daughter and had to navigate the changed landscape of her considerable disabilities. So there was something about that that prepared me to go to the hospice. And then when I was at the hospice, the questions that kept coming back were the why me question in various guises. But also this really worrying idea to me that the illnesses that people were struggling with in the hospice were meaningless,
Yeah.
that they were just random afflictions, and that they carried no more meaning or purpose in their lives than that. And that seemed to me to devalue the people who had those illnesses quite a lot. So that's really what I got interested in responding as a Christian chaplain to that question of why me, and is my suffering meaningless? Yeah.
And so in your Whitley, you are taking some of those ideas of wanting to explore suffering, to explore what it is to talk about persons and people, and wanting to talk about stories as well. And it seems to me those are the three big ideas.
Yeah.
And then wanting to say something meaning. So do you want to just draw out anything very briefly then from that argument?
I think I've made a few sort of summary notes that I felt that what the faith, so as a chaplain in that setting, people constantly ask this question and were often dissatisfied with the responses that I gave, although they kept wanting to perhaps have the conversation and extend it further. And I think what I came to think was that the faith doesn't answer that question, but it gives a framework of meaning for all that happens to us in life. And when I say meaning, I don't mean understanding, and I don't mean a rational explanation, and I don't mean an answer to the question why, but something about perhaps signification, pointing on to something bigger. And I think that the church is the mediator perhaps of this meaning, by holding people's stories against the normative story of the Gospels. And that's kind of one way of looking at the church's task. And of course, in the Gospels, suffering is normative. Paul says, I preached Christ and him crucified, and there's that complete sort of sense that the crucifixion is front and center of what takes place. And yet somehow there were plenty of people with faith who still struggled with this question, even though that's supposed to be our normative story. So I was interested in that, and I felt that there was a connection with productivity and function and being able to do things. And so I was aware that there was this kind of isolation of people who were terminally ill. They kind of end up with people not talking to them very much because they don't know what to say, or they end up in the hospice or the hospital or at home, and people often leave a wide berth because they don't know how to deal with that. But that happens with disabilities to some extent as well, and maybe not quite the same, but there are lots of things that you can't participate in when you're terminally ill, when you're very disabled. And I felt that in some ways our daughter was missing in some accounts because of her disabilities, because she couldn't do this, do that, do the other. She was never going to have a job, she's never going to graduate, she's never going to feature in those kinds of data. So I wanted to pick away at that connection, and I think it did kind of fall out for me in the work of this lecture, in that the meaning that we are given around suffering, it is not a kind of this is the cause and this is the effect, or this is the problem and this is the answer, but it's entirely a framework for life in which we should expect suffering, and we may not get an answer for why we're having it. And actually that is normative, we just don't like it because of the materialist culture we live in. So my question on the subtitle is, has the church caved in to that materialist view rather than embracing the gospel view in which suffering is a normative experience? And when I say normative, I don't necessarily mean that we should love suffering in some kind of weird way, but
you say that quite clearly.
Yeah. So that's it. So sort of in short, suffering is a normative experience. we need one another because we need to explore our stories through dialogue. And our value is as our presence as dialogue partners, not as functional entities.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a clash of cultures in that, which dissenters should be able to inhabit comfortably, but actually even we don't. I think very often we don't really like being on the margins as dissenters. We actually crave to be more important and more substantial. And I think there's an interesting question in there about dissent for the modern age.
Yeah. I've got loads of things that I've would potentially would ask, but I'll let others come and join or speak or ask something first.
Well, I was curious, I mean, forgive my ignorance, but have you carried on writing poetry? One of my favorite bits of the talk was the poem at the end, and I wondered whether that was kind of part of a continuing practice on your part.
It is actually. About 2 years ago, I set myself a Lent discipline of writing a poem every day in Lent about where God was really in what was happening. So it was about, my discipline for Lent was to pay attention to small things and write a short poem every day. And I was quite pleased with that 40-day collection of poems, and I might do something with that at some point. But yes, I do periodically write poems, and my spiritual director challenged me to do that one. She said to me, okay, you're doing all this research, what difference has it made to you? I talked a lot about lament in my PhD, so she said, where's your lament then? So she challenged me. So I went and did a quiet day and wrote the lament on the quiet day for my daughter. And it's interesting you should say that, because a lot of people warmed to that bit of the lecture. So I think, yeah, that's.
I remember you offering that at the end of the, when I heard it at the assembly. Yeah.
And it's also just interesting, isn't it? Well, I think whenever academic work, whenever there's a little gear change in a piece of academic writing, and it's quite a kind of interestingly vulnerable moment for when one's writing as a scholar.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what I've done talks on this, well, on disability theology more perhaps than on this lecture, but obviously I've taught modules at undergraduate and master's level in disability theology, and I've also done sort of accessible talks in churches, and I've often included that poem, and I've felt that even if people were left behind on some of the other aspects, there's been something about the lament that they've been able to get hold of. So I think it is true that poetry speaks in an interesting way, isn't it? It sort of it opens things up for people because they can enter it in different places and different ways.
Has anyone read Michael Rosen's book of poems about the benefits of nearly dying?
No.
Oh no, I don't think I have. Is that good?
It is very. It appears to be flippant, but actually it's very profound, and it's out of his experience where he caught COVID and then all the complications from COVID, and he was in a coma for a long time, and coming to find himself again when he wasn't quite sure who he was, and connecting with his feet and his hands and things, because they were him. Partly because they're only about 8 lines each. It's very readable. One of the reading groups is looking at it, but it is quite. It is very funny, but it's actually very thought-provoking as well.
I think I heard him do a talk on the radio about his experience, and I hadn't realised he'd written as well, so I should have a look out for that.
And your kind of more recent research in disability theology and your research in more recent disability theology, has that kind of, is there anything that has come up in that you'd want to kind of expand on from this text?
I think sort of yes and no. I think I was reaching after something when I was doing this lecture that I'm not sure if I quite fully got hold of it. And I think I wrote a paper about the healings in John's Gospel, which is in JBTC. And I think I managed to grasp it a little bit more there. And it's something about, I'm uncomfortable with disability that's predicated on this sociological assumptions around disability in, if I can call it, secular culture. And I think a lot of disability kind of theology kind of starts from there. And I want to say, I think we need to go beyond liberation theology, actually, because I think if we're not careful with an over application of liberation theology, we just end up recreating polar differences, but we move the goalposts for them. So it's like, okay, we deliver the oppressed, but what does that then mean for what happens afterwards? It seems to me it doesn't go far enough, or maybe it doesn't quite ask the right questions about what comes after. And Jesus says very clearly, you will always have the poor with you. So that says to me that however many oppressions we release and deliver, there's going to be another one. And actually, it's not wrong to release those oppressions, but is that the main event, or are we actually being asked to look at something else in terms of the gospel story and what we're called to do? And I think we are, and something about it is about that testimony to the kingdom, testimony to Christ, and that may include, of course, a testimony about suffering and Jesus wasn't released from Gethsemane suffering, and he wasn't released from the cross. And I think there's something really important about that. Which, and again, I want to, Andy acknowledged earlier, I want to say that I don't think suffering is good in and of itself, but I think it is unavoidable in a human life. And if we think we can avoid it, I think we're kidding ourselves, really.
Yeah. For me, reading it, I've quite a few moments I thought, this sounds like, and I don't know if you know the work Sally or anyone else does, the work of Brian Brock in Wondrously Wounded. And actually, you're picking up a lot of ideas which he then, that he, the idea of how we have a too medicalized view of the person, especially the disabled person or perhaps the dying person, and he pushes against that. The idea that actually we should be thinking about personhood perhaps from the window of disability, rather than thinking about personhood apart from disability, but actually they might speak to, so a number of points I thought actually what you're doing here, others have taken, I don't know because they read your Whitley lecture, but the whole
I doubt it.
But I think you're onto something in a number of places which other theologians and thinkers have taken and developed. And I think that was, it was really interesting to see, there's just little nuggets of connection in that way. I think one thing that I noticed, Sally, quite a few times, and you've mentioned the word just a little bit earlier, is how often the word dissent appears. And out of all the Whitley lectures that we've read, I think perhaps yours has got the most occurrences of the word dissent, and reminding us that we are dissenters, and that's been our history, and possibly we've lost that sense of dissent. But and here I thought actually within what you're writing was actually also a theology of dissent, and not perhaps in the way that dissenters might have thought themselves back in the 17th century, but what might it mean to dissent in the 20th, 21st? Yeah.
Yes, totally. I think so, and I do think that it's about cleaving to this gospel story above all else, and saying no, actually, I will not evaluate a person as the modern Western worldview evaluates a person. I'm going to dissent against that, and I'm going to use a gospel evaluation of the person. But I worry with, things like charity law, you know, financial models, our constructions of you know, constitutions and the way we conduct our meetings. It's so embedded in that materialism. All of that sort of stuff comes out of a materialistic culture and worldview, which is aimed towards functionalism.
And let me just push you. And I'm not sure at any point, I was trying to find it, that you defined materialism or this materialist, but I think I picked it up on one point. You mean non-transcendent?
I did put
In
a
a kind of-
definition in a footnote.
Did you? I must have missed it.
Yes. Well, no, actually, I defined modern. I'm sorry. So modern, perhaps modernism rather than materialism would be good. A commitment to a meta-narrative or master story told with scientific rigor and a utopian hope.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this and materialism in the not in the grasping after good sense.
No.
In the sort of scientific, ratio scientific sense.
So for me, that was another resonance. So I've been reading some work of a guy called Andrew Root, who's written a series called On Ministry in a Secular Age, where he's borrowing heavily from Charles Taylor, who you reference, but Charles Taylor's Secular Age, where he talks about we live in such an immanent culture and we've lost any sense of transcendence, which I think, again, for me, was interesting reading this and how some connections that I've from elsewhere were coming into this and how that, especially around that, I guess the question of suffering, if you're completely materialist and completely immanent, it's difficult to make any sense. Yeah.
Totally.
I had kind of an opposite experience reading the paper, because because I was thinking about this year's Gunton Day lecture by Kerry Day, who's a womanist theologian from the US, and she espouses what she calls a materialist theology. And so when I saw the title, I just automatically assumed that the materialist subversion of the church was going to be what you were offering, Sally. You know, that this was going to be a kind of like very kind of postmodern turning things around and subverting our kind of ideas with the gospel's materialistic. And about, you know, at a certain point in the paper, I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, I think I've got the wrong end of the stick here.
Yeah.
And was that good, Ewan, or bad?
Well, I think, I don't know. I think maybe materialism is quite a kind of slippery word, isn't it? Because it gets used, you know, to mean, you know, I guess grasping after money, reductionist scientism, and then, you know, where Kerry Day was taking it was more towards a kind of theology of the flesh.
Yeah.
And of dirt and of the ground and of the earth, and wanting, you know, to read it, you know, in terms of some of the kind of resonances of the natural world, which our modernistic frameworks have kind of occluded. But then also, I don't know, there's also a kind of different idea of Aristotelian idea of material, which is even kind of doesn't really fit into that framework either. So it's a kind of, I don't know, it's just a different word and people use it in different ways as far as I can see.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yes. If I rewrote it, a definition would be a good idea. Yeah. I think that it's interesting, though, to think there was a little bit in the lecture about how this plays out in terms of the power of medicine, because that sort of keys into the desire for a solution very much. And I read a lot of work by an Australian anthropologist called Beverly McNamara, which really impacted me, because she talked about the native peoples of Australia, indigenous peoples, and how they didn't want palliative care if it meant that they had to leave the land that they'd been born on because of the connection with their ancestors, and they would eschew pain relief and stuff. I mean, obviously not if it could be brought to them, but if it meant that they had to leave the land and they weren't going to die on that bit of land, that they wouldn't leave, and they would endure suffering for this sort of transcendent purpose, which I found really interesting. And she made the point that in the West, because obviously in Australia the two cultures collide, don't they? So she makes this point that in the West we used to live with an eye on preparing for the life to come, but now we just want to live as long as possible. And actually that places almost I think I wrote another paper about this once, it replaces the priest with the doctor. And there are loads of functions, priestly functions, that the doctor now executes, if you think about it in that way, which is quite interesting, and probably not fair on doctors, because it's putting a lot of responsibility on them that I'm sure they don't want. But it's interesting how you know, that has been viewed, and also to think about whether that might change with the erosion of authority in postmodernism, you know, whether that might be shifting as well as time goes on. Yeah.
We're obviously revisiting your Whitley lecture 1 week out from the UK government taking its first vote on a new assisted dying bill. And I couldn't not read your lecture and some of what you're exploring without having that in the background. And I think, again, your lecture actually perhaps is quite a helpful, not that you're directly focusing on that, but actually there's material within your lecture, which I think, again, reminds us that actually what is the story and what are the stories that are being told. And again, the individualism, I think, sometimes of behind some of the assisted dying things, at least that's how I'm hearing some of it, and how actually, you know, part of what you're offering is something different.
Yes, I think that's a really good connection. And interestingly, the Joffrey bill, which was the first traverse through Parliament, was taking place when I was working at the hospice, and I found it interesting to see the shift in attitude generally between that, which was 2006, I think, the Joffrey bill, and this, because I think there's been, you know, a very big amount of movement, it seems to me, in that time. And I worry about some of the assumptions that are made. So assumptions about suffering and who is suffering, and whether we can make judgments about other people's suffering. You know, I think there's an awful lot of questions in there, and I think you're right that our individualism and our desire to have control and autonomy lies at the root of a lot of the things that are being said, and ultimately I don't think it's sustainable.
And that's where McFadden's, I think, view of the person is radically different, perhaps, of the view of the person that's been expressed, at least in some corners at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. And interestingly, even with Tesco's opening in Stornoway on Sunday, you know, people were saying, well, if you want to go in there, you can go in there. If you don't want to go in there, you don't have to. And I thought, oh, how beautifully postmodern we are. But it's exactly the same, isn't it? You know, it's kind of that's your story, this is my story, that's your truth. But actually I think we can't have my story and your story and my truth and your truth, because we generate that story in relationship, and we can't escape those relationships. I mean, even if we live in an isolated setting, you know, as a hermit or something, we're inescapably bound into other people at certain points of our lives. You know, we just can't escape our relationality.
It's a sad footnote and off the subject, as it were, that kind of the postmodernism of your story, my story, has actually lent people to be able to say, my truth is truth, even though it's a lie.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And very publicly in some places. Yes. Yeah. But I do feel it is unsustainable, because it cannot be, but I don't know how long it's going to take before culturally, you know, the roundabout goes round and people say, oh, actually, maybe that wasn't the best way of doing things. We need to consult a bit more, or, you know, listen to one another a little bit more. But I like McFadden, and practically, there are some theological problems with its model, which have been well rehearsed, and there's no escaping those. But practically, it works really well as a pastoral tool to explore relationships and damaged individuals. And
So,
yeah.
so one thing is where, so, you know, again, just in case you haven't read the lecture, part of what McFadden is wanting to offer in his book, A Call to Personhood, is this idea of the person as being a person always in dialogue, a call and response going on.
Yeah.
I guess there are some forms of disability where there is it very hard to have any kind of dialogue.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. And except that I think that when we say dialogue, we tend to default to a rational conversation, and I don't really think that's what it is. I think it's about a posture towards one another. So I mean, we don't have conversations with our daughter really, but we relate. We have dialogue with her in a fuller sense of the word dialogue, and there isn't actually a problem in sorting out most things. I know some people have things like locked-in syndrome and stuff like that, and that, you know, that's going to be difficult to be a responsive relationship. But I still think that there is the fact that that person is there. They are being in our presence, and we are being in their presence, and we need to watch the tenor of our posture towards one another within the limitations of the response from some people. So yeah, I think it's about not defining it too tightly.
Yeah.
Do you feel?
Oh, Valerie, you just muted yourself. That's it. Yeah.
Do you feel nowadays that it's all so tightly regulated that in actual fact the church is kind of being used as a not a place for spirituality where you know, everybody has value as a humanity thing, but in actual fact this is one of the branches of the social services, and you will run within what we say, in other words what the government says. And I think that when you were referring to assisted dying, you see, I've got a brother who's sort of, well, he's the baby of the family, but he's just 71. But after the injections, he had a series of heart attacks in Exeter, and he's ended up being an amputee. And the whole of church is totally different for him now, you know, because of where he is and what he's done. And there is a sense in which he's looking, because he was a widower, because it's been so difficult and all that sort of thing, he is looking for spiritual help. And they say, well, no, you don't need that. You just need this regime of sort of, you know, stuff to keep you alive kind of thing. And you've got to pay for your own care kind of thing. So there isn't any care for you because you're wealthy enough to not have it kind of thing. And it seems to me that whereas at one time, if you were in hospital, you would ask to see the padre, the chaplain. Nowadays, they say, well, you don't want really all that. So all you need to do is to sign this thing and, you know, we'll decide when it's time for you to shuffle off. And as a coffin dodger myself, I really object to this because I don't want to go until God says I go, and I want to end well. It's the spiritual thing that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a sad reflection if the offer of chaplaincy is not being offered fully. My sense is in most hospitals that chaplaincy is still taken very seriously, and would be offered and encouraged for those who felt actually that's something that would be helpful and
I
important?
think they're more reticent. I felt that they were more reticent because it might be offensive.
Yes, there are strict rules about not, for example, not proselytizing, and I think there is an increased sensitivity about chaplaincy interventions because of that, because people are now very outspoken in not wanting to be it to be assumed that they want religious intervention, for example. So in Scotland, they've gone wholesale in hospital chaplaincy for generic chaplains who they just offer generic spiritual care. So if people want to exercise their faith, it will tend to be by referral to a priest or an imam or whatever else in the community. So I knew someone who moved up to Scotland recently and took up a healthcare chaplaincy, and I think she's found that change of culture quite difficult.
Yeah.
But I think it's heading that way in the UK, in England as well, south of the border. I think that's probably the direction of travel. And I've seen advertisements for sort of, multi-faith chaplains, all kinds of chaplains. So it used to be dealt with by having a team with a variety of chaplains in it. So you would have had a team with a rabbi and a Muslim, or at least access to a rabbi, a Muslim, Church of England, Free Church, Catholic, that sort of thing. And it used to be done like that. But I think now there's a bit of a drift towards chaplaincy just being more spiritual care and calling in perhaps experts when needed. But it's a journey, it's not fully resolved, but I think it does come from the thing that you identify about people being anxious about not wanting to have anything imposed on them that they may not believe in or want to believe in.
Which speaks back to, the modern materialist immanentness of our culture, which really struggles to, I think, to do I think Charles Taylor in The Secular Age is I think onto it, in actually naming that's what it's like, and so how you want to say that there is a bigger story, what what in your lecture you talk the gospel story or something on transcendence is, I think, tricky. At the same time, I think actually in the experience of suffering, there is sometimes the window to say, is this all there is, or is there a bigger story surrounding it? And sometimes that can be an opportunity. Although
Yes.
I think care is needed, as you just suggested, Sally. Sorry.
No, I think you're right. And I think this is why stories work, because stories have this transcendent, as we talked earlier about the poem being a way in for people. Yeah. I mean, a poem is a form of story. But there is something about the form of story that lets the transcendent in. And so telling stories is the way to do it. And we have a wonderful story at our disposal. If we can find sensitive ways of telling it and we have to have permission, of course, these days as well. But I noticed one of the things why I got interested in story when I worked at the hospice was that the therapies that were most effective with people who were dying was to talk about their life story, and everybody did it. The bereavement counsellor did it, the social worker did it, the art therapist did it, the nurses did it, I did it, and so I really wanted to interrogate that in my PhD as well. Is it okay as a Christian chaplain just to use this technique that everybody else uses, and why does it work? And does it work because of God being the God that God is? So those questions are interesting as well to me, and I think that storytelling is great. Great way in.
Kind of goes back to something Sally said almost at the beginning, really, that suffering is perceived to be a problem that seeks a cure, like everything else does. So to some extent, medical people often feel that they failed if someone dies under their care. because there should have been an answer for it. And to some extent, I guess the story of the church, as you transcended in a different way. You may be suffering, but hey, just wait till the good old days and you'll be up there with God in heaven. So just put up with it for a little bit longer. And it's coming to understand, and in some respects, the assisted dying is a very dramatic way of saying, here is a way of solving your problem. It's how you get people to see suffering not as a problem, but as you say, a land of which there are perhaps few tracks, a wild trackless waste, but which people will go in and they cannot avoid it in some way or another and still be human because of the transactions and the relationships and everything else they have in common.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot on. And of course, there's always the pastoral dimension, isn't there? That, you know, for some people, that I think the problem is when somebody's actually in that place where they are terminally ill and they're up against it. In a sense, it would have been nice if that conversation had been had in less critical circumstances. You know, it's not always pastorally appropriate to have that conversation. I think is the way forward, but you can't always have it when at the time when it really matters, and that is partly the loss of you know, spirituality in our environment in a way that we would have not spirituality. People are still spiritual, but a recognizable faith story, shall we say. We don't have that landscape embedded in the same way, and it's a pity because that's something that, you know, could draw on as a kind of shared narrative of explanation, and it's really not there anymore for the majority of people.
Sorry.
Go, Valerie.
How did you find it in the pandemic when disabled people, that is what we used to call mentally handicapped people, had all their support and actual activities and everything just cut?
I mean, well, I can only speak of our family, but our daughter struggled enormously. She's can't really. She's got huge speech and language difficulties, and she's deaf, and she's got physical and cognitive difficulties as well. But she's very sociable, and so suddenly she's stuck at home with us, and there's three of us all the time, day after day after day. She just stopped eating.
Without any sort of explanation, really.
Well, not that we could give her, because she thinks things have to be quite concrete to, you know, to explain them. And also she got very upset if either of us coughed. She was beside herself with distress because she'd somehow picked up the idea that if you coughed, that was bad. And she was clearly very stressed because of worrying about the coughing, not seeing anybody other than us, and probably being quite bored actually because there was so little that she can actually do. And she just stopped eating. We got very close to anorexia, and it was very, very worrying. I mean, her hair started falling out, all sorts of things. Took 2 to 3 years for that to get right again. I say she's just about right again now, but I think yeah, carry on. Yeah,
I think COVID was very reflective in terms of, again, what view of the person dominated, and very much was a science one, which I think in many ways was positive. It was about saving lives and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't a relational view going on. To be honest, my sense is if we had another pandemic, any government probably might not do the same things, you know, and because actually closing the schools was just as harmful for many, many young children as, you know, for those with learning difficulties or not. And so it's interesting, isn't it? Again, what is the personhood, the view of the person and the view of society and the view of, you know, all those kind of things at work. And I guess COVID gave us a moment to stop and say, actually, this is the dominant thing at work here. Because I guess the other ones were, again, you had this, there was an economic view of the person going on. We need to get people back to work to keep the economy going. And it's a fascinating kind of thing there. And perhaps a missed opportunity for the church, perhaps, to have spoken more powerfully into, and actually maybe not just the church, other faith communities as well, a much more relational view. Although I think, again, that would have been challenging to have those multiple views at work, and it's not one is better than the other, because the science was important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I pick you up? One of the interesting things for me about the lecture again is you dropped some Baptist ecclesiology in there. So page 19, you talk in the main paragraph, in the Baptist practice of church meeting and seeking the mind of Christ, we have a structure that's equipped to hear the
This is the generic poor, Hebrew word. It means, the poor, including the marginalised, the widows, the foreigners.
I googled it, Sally. I googled it.
Fab.
And going on, in our practice of ministry, we have tried to ensure there's an equality of opportunity for other voices to speak. In our commitment to the Word of God, we allow the story of Scripture to write and rewrite the script for the life drama in which we are the actors. When someone is baptized, the testimony, the telling of the transforming power of the gospel narrative is part of why we are moved and challenged. I'm not sure that's always true, but but it's there. And again, for me, other resonances as I read your lecture was then resonating with what Ruth Moriarty's done in the study of church meetings and slow wisdom, and how perhaps what you're arguing here around the place of everybody having a voice and everyone's story being heard, our church meetings don't really do that. Maybe that goes on in our worship sometimes or in other places. But I just, again, I think you had a vision of being Baptist here, which I thought actually was quite powerful, to speak not just into the context of what you were writing, but more broadly as well.
Yes, and I think you're right. I mean, I think it's possibly a dream rather than a reality. But if anyone is going to be able to do it, we should be able to do it. And I think that's really exciting. We do have a structure that should permit this. And if it doesn't, then that's just our brokenness, isn't it? And our inability to do that. But in principle, we should be able to hear those voices. Partly because as a denomination, we've been there. We've been in that marginalised space, shouting at King James I and all the rest of it and not being heard. We know what this is. This is our sort of generative space. Well,
we did, but we perhaps have amnesia about it now. But
yeah. But we should. I think this is the point. We should. This is dissent. This is what dissent is about and where it's located to sort of push. I mean, dissent can only be, and dissenting structures can only be defined against the status quo, can't they? So I think if we are going to retain the name of dissenter, then we have to also retain the status of on the edges, and that raises questions, I think, about some of our desire to have big churches and very successful churches, and to have a voice in this and to have a voice in that, and think, well, that's okay up to a point, but it needs to be a dissenting voice in those spaces, not just one of the pack. And it's really hard to maintain that, isn't it? Because it's the place of dissent changes. And I mean, I remember having a conversation with an Anglican who said, surely these days we have common cause against a wider culture that doesn't really believe in Jesus anymore. And I think there's something in that, actually, that, we would have defined ourselves against the state church, but actually now state church is also marginalised in wider culture. I think we have to think about a common cause in some of that, and our dissent is expressing itself in different ways in different places.
I've just been working through some church minutes from the 1790s and 1800s.
As you do.
As you do. And the formal minutes actually are quite depressing, really. Well, it's interesting in some respects. They tell you they're desperately worried because it's the Napoleonic War. They're desperately worried about the poor harvests. So they actually record how much the wheat and barley costs in the local markets because the poor people and everybody else is suffering. But apart from that, what the minutes say basically is this person proposed to be a member. We appointed visitors, we heard from them and we accepted them. And sometimes if they stepped out of line, we dismissed them or excluded them or put them on probation. What it's apparently they didn't have, as it were, is all these deep discussions about what it meant to be a Baptist when you were still persecuted by the state church and so on and so forth. Which, and it's about evolution. I remember Morris West saying, always remember it's the church meeting and not church meeting. In that sense, it's a rediscovery perhaps of how the church meeting happens on a Sunday, happens at when you get together to decide about budget, it's there when you gather around the scriptures to express something. It's there when the minister takes communion to someone who can't get out. And it's much more of a mosaic than we might have imagined in the 18th or 17th century of actually how you can see this church meeting. And I think that is something perhaps, whilst you may have common cause, not only with the Anglicans or the Catholics, but with Muslims as well, actually, of bringing the sense that there is something beyond your everyday existence. There is the possibility of doing things differently. But I would agree with Sally that this tends to work in smaller numbers. It doesn't work when your whole emphasis is kind of on a Sunday and the experience of Sunday. And then you come back the next Sunday having had that experience and rehash it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's not Beach and Groves minutes you've been reading, is it?
It's actually Childhouse Streets.
I remember looking in some of the Beach and Grove ones and seeing about people being put out of communion because they'd stolen a turnip or because they'd spoken to the Anglican vicar and things like that.
It took me a little while to work out that criminal conversation meant sex out of marriage.
Oh, interesting.
I was fascinated to read in Wellow, which is a tiny church now closed on the Isle of Wight, that in the First World War. Now they lost quite a lot of people there, and it's a mainly farming community. But looking at the church meeting, you're absolutely right. You would hardly have guessed the World War was going on. You know, it was very, very within the village. And the people who'd gone simply had, you know, he's away, and nobody said anything about the fact that, you know, people were away for months and months and months, and then they were missing and everything. It was hardly mentioned.
Well, I guess that may reflect of what gets recorded and what doesn't get recorded.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's interesting, isn't it, in terms of how minutes are kept. And you know, we all know that there are some people who like to have a very, very full minute of everything that happens, and others who minute very much more briefly. And I wonder if some of that is going on because yes, but it does reflect it. Yeah, sorry, Stephen.
No, I think this is a good point. I remember someone, again, looking at Abraham Booth's church, which was quite a significant church in the late 18th century in London. And they had a minute book going from sort of 1769 to about 1813 they were looking for. 1769 to 1813 included the American Revolution, the war against France, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, none of which got a mention. And in a sense, it's because, as you're right, that's not what the church book is for. The church book is to transact, to be the activities of God with these people. And by and large, that doesn't extend to Pitt's campaigns against Napoleon.
Yeah. Bringing us back to the lecture, I guess, you know, as we finish, for me, I really like that word, the multi-log. And, you know, that vision of having, when the church meets in whatever context it might be, we try and ensure, and I think this is your key argument of making sure everyone's heard and everyone's story is giving a space and a place. again, I came away challenged by that to how we make that happen, recognizing that not every well, there's something about sometimes, I don't know if you do this in a church meeting where you ask for kind of news. The only bit of news that you're ever given is so and so is unwell, dying, whatever like this. It's all the kind of pastoral kind of need things. You never get anything positive. But equally, sometimes everything is positive, and I think part of what you're saying here, Sally, is we kind of brush past those things which are more difficult to connect or resonate with. And I guess it's finding that place that honors everybody, that honors the person who is suffering, and honors those who are suffering with them, or aware of their suffering, and yeah.
Yes, I think that's right, and yes, and I think it is challenging, and again, the bigger the church gets, the more difficult it is, isn't it? And I think one of the things that I've noticed in some settings, this is not true of my own church at all at the moment, but in some settings, this thing about toxic positivity, where you're sort of compelled to say something encouraging. And if you haven't got anything encouraging to say, then you zip up, and that worries me as well, because I feel that is a false narrative of life. There is going to be somebody in the room for who things are actually difficult, and maybe they need to articulate that to their brothers and sisters in Christ. So there are some things like that I think are difficult. And sometimes that infects the church. Let's just give thanks for something, and you don't get the opportunity to lament or weep, corporately over something in the same way, because that's not perceived to be worship or praise or whatever. So yeah, I do think it's really interesting how these things work out in practice.
That's the joy of a big church, because if you are wrestling lifelong with things that you don't want other people to have known, then you can be anonymous in a big church, and they'll all discuss about, for hours on end, about whether we paint the lavatory pink, and then they will run through £240,000 worth of building work on the knot. And you can within a big church, you can only engage in as much spiritual thing as you can take. It doesn't help your personal walk with God, but on the other hand, it is a way of being church.
Yeah, well, it is, and there's data, isn't there, that suggests that churches where you observe rather than participate are growing. So like Cathedral, the Charismatic, the Orthodox, those are places where there's increased interest, because you can be invisible, which is interesting. But you're right, I think it raises other questions about spiritual growth and development,
and what view of the person is operating.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, Sally, thank you. We have spent an hour engaging with your lecture, which, and I say this every single time when we finish our conversation, which I think is as timely now as it was perhaps back in 2009. And hopefully, if anyone ends up watching this, they'll go away and revisit or read your lecture and find it as beneficial as we've done in our conversation. So we thank you for you writing it back in 2009. We thank you for joining us here in 2024, discussing it again, and we look forward to more of your writing and reflection around these issues and others. Thank you.